Hello, world, and welcome to the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterlund, coming to you from the vacation destination known as Cape Cod, Massachusetts, and this is episode 165. We are knee-deep in spooky season, and there's going to be a lot of true crime, a lot of spooky subjects in this week's podcast. We're going to start it off with the story of Hadden Clark, a convicted serial killer that longtime listeners of the podcast might be familiar with due to my involvement with the Lady of the Dunes documentary. We're going to go way, way back in the day and look at a story that I've been waiting to tell for years, and that is the brief time that my family had a pet bat. This is all true. There will be a brand new top 5. We're going to look at the top 5 1990s horror movies. And there'll be a brand new This Week in History and Time capsule looking back at the infamous Black Sox Baseball World Series scandal. All of that is coming up right now on episode 165 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Welcome in, everybody. I hope that you are enjoying spooky season, the countdown to Halloween. Do you have all your candy yet? Or at least enough for yourself, and then there's still time to go buy some more if you eat it all? There's so much fun stuff to talk about this week. Every now and then I sprinkle true crime into the actual podcast, but I do try to save a lot of these topics for October. And you heard during the preview what we're going to talk about. We'll dive into all that stuff in a minute. Naturally, I cannot start my podcast off properly without thanking my Patreon subscribers, Laurie, Mary Lou, Ashley, Kevin, Marguerite, Leo. Thank you all so much for being the ones that actually put your money where your mouth is, supporting me, supporting my content. $5 a month on Patreon gets you access to bonus podcast episodes, early access to YouTube videos, early access to the main show. If you're one of those subscribers on Patreon, you have likely already seen the new podcast logo that is coming up in conjunction with the 4-year anniversary of the show. I put it up a month early so that people on Patreon can see exactly what I've done. I'm really excited about it. It's going to better reflect what the show is at this point in time. Another big thing I wanted to share before we get started is that I've actually begun doing the video podcast that I have been talking about basically for the entirety of 2024. The webcam weekly wrap-up show is up on YouTube. I'm already a few episodes deep. It's the video version of my Initial Impressions 2.0 blog. Lots of funny, random, foolish stuff with my stupid face there. But we've got a lot of photos and videos, and it's fun. It's free-flowing. The link to the first episode is in the description of the podcast, so if you want to go check that out, definitely give it a watch. In a little peek behind the curtain, I will be honest that today, as I'm recording the podcast, I started the day off with a massive migraine headache. Back in episode 74, I did a bonus episode of the podcast about growing up with migraine headaches and what they're like. They are rarer at this point in my life, which I'm blessed about. But I'm mentioning this because I had to take a lot of medication to kind of get me to feel better because I don't want to skip out on the podcast or even delay it a few days. So if I sound more wacky and foolish than usual, it's because I'm medicated. My head feels still a little bad, but I think by the end of the podcast, I'll be my old self. That makes it so that when you listen, you can kind of listen more intently to see if there's anything where you're like, oh yeah, I can see he's feeling good now. The medication has kicked in. What is the medication? Little bit of caffeine, little bit of THC maybe, little bit of aspirin. Anyway, it's going to make for a fun show. We're going to start off here by talking about a not fun person, a convicted serial killer. He's been mentioned several times on this podcast in conjunction with the Lady of the Dunes documentary, but now here in spooky season, he's going to get his own segment so you know the full story behind Hadden Clark, coming up right now on episode 165 of the In My Footsteps podcast. If you had told me 3 or 4 years ago that I would be in possession of 8 letters handwritten by a convicted serial killer, I just said, I don't know what kind of road my life has taken. In my association with Frank Durant on the Lady of the Dunes documentary, I mean, that was more shadowing him so that I could get information for my Searching for the Lady of the Dunes book. During those times, I became acquainted with a man named Hadden Clark. He was long considered one of the suspects in the murder of the Lady of the Dunes, later identified as Ruth Marie Terry. From Frank's interactions with him via letters, through my reading of his letters, it painted a picture of a deeply disturbed, psychotic individual. He was diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic, which made everything that he wrote kind of to be taken with a grain of salt. He was convicted of 2 murders, with him claiming that he killed anywhere from 6, 8, 10, 12 more. His name later came up when in his last letter to Frank, he casually threw in that he might have been one of the last people to see teenager Bonnie Bickwit alive before she and her boyfriend Mitchell Weiser disappeared in July 1973 on the way to the Summer Jam concert in upstate New York. So for me, he's been kind of an ancillary player to the main points, the main stories here, Lady of the Dunes, Mitchell and Bonnie. But what about him? What about his actual story? Hadden Clark was born in Troy, New York, July 31st, 1952, and he came from a deeply dysfunctional family. His father, Hadden Sr., was an abusive alcoholic. His mother, Flavia, was equally unstable, reportedly prone to violent outbursts. This childhood with a chaotic marriage marked by frequent arguments and physical abuse shaped Hadden Clark. He was an eccentric child who often struggled to fit in, exhibiting signs of gender confusion from a young age, frequently dressing in girls' clothing. His family was cruel in response, particularly his older brother, Bradfield Clark, who relentlessly bullied him. His mother even dressed him often as a girl, further confusing his identity and fueling the rage that would later manifest. As is sometimes the case with these serial killers, Clark began to act out violently as a young child, killing small animals, torturing pets. He had a connection to Cape Cod, his grandparents having a home on a rural road in the town of Wellfleet. This time in the late 1960s, early 70s, is where Hadden Clark's connection to the Lady of the Dunes comes into play. He worked in several Provincetown restaurants, most notably the Moors. And it was during this time, in his letters to Frank, that he would claim that he had murdered people, that he had taken treasures, trinkets, jewelry from them, and buried them on his grandparents' property far back in the woods. In his letters to Frank, Hadden Clark's association with the Lady of the Dunes would change with each letter. He would go from saying he knew who she was to he didn't know who she was, but he was there when she was killed in the dunes. Then he would say he actually killed her, but then he would say he didn't kill her, but knew who she was. Then he would have no knowledge, and it would just be a swirl. And you had to kind of go with his paranoid schizophrenic diagnosis. He ended up not being involved in the Lady of the Dunes case. Whether he knew anyone who was involved in that, that's still up for debate. He hasn't said. He hasn't said the truth, at least. But whatever he did on Cape Cod during those years, late 60s, early 70s, his life took a significant turn when he enlisted in the U.S. Navy in 1974. This career was short-lived, though, because during his service, his odd behavior continued, including incidents where he was caught dressing in women's clothing. He was frequently reprimanded for erratic conduct and stealing, and within a year, he was discharged from the Navy after being diagnosed paranoid schizophrenic. Following this discharge, Hadden Clark wandered through life, taking up odd jobs, cook, landscaper, handyman. This transient lifestyle, combined with his mental health issues and drug use, led him to drift between towns across the Northeast. This is what makes it feasible that he could have been witness to or involved with the Lady of the Dunes case in Provincetown in July 1974, but also be someone that was familiar with Bonnie Bickwit in upstate New York in July 1973. Dressing up in women's clothing doesn't make you a bad person. It is a little bit bizarre when combined with the rest of Hadden Clark's motif, I guess. But despite those bizarre actions, he managed to live under the radar for years and developed a tendency and an ability to hide his darker personality traits behind a facade of seemingly a harmless, eccentric drifter. As I said, he was convicted for 2 known murders. Whether he killed before the first known one, I can't say, but we're going to dive into the first. The murder of Michelle Dorr in 1986. 6-year-old Michelle was a friend of Hadden Clark's niece Elizabeth. On May 31st, 1986, Clark was staying at his brother Jeff's house in Silver Spring, Maryland, and Michelle came by to play with Elizabeth, unaware that Clark was in the home. In what is described as a frenzied episode, Hadden Clark abducted Michelle from the yard, took her inside the house, and murdered her by stabbing her in the chest. He then buried her body in a nearby park where it remained hidden for more than 5 years. Sadly, during that time, Michelle's father, Carl Dorr, was considered the prime suspect in her disappearance, which left the case cold. Years later, in April 1992, when he was in prison, Hadden Clark confessed to Michelle's murder and led authorities to the location of her remains, giving closure to the Dorr family, but that's little solace after what happened to their daughter. The murder of Laura Hoteling, 1992. She was Hadden Clark's second known victim, 23-year-old Laura, who lived in Bethesda, Maryland. At the time of the murder, Hadden Clark was working as a landscaper and part-time handyman for the Hoteling family. Laura had recently returned from college, and on October 18, 1992, she disappeared without a trace. Hadden Clark entered Laura's home while she was alone, disguised himself in women's clothing, and brutally murdered her. He then dragged her body to a nearby wooded area where he buried her in a shallow grave covered with debris. Initially, there were no leads, but Hadden Clark's suspicious behavior quickly drew attention. He was arrested when evidence, including blood-stained pillowcases and a strand of Laura's hair, was found in his possession. Clark was convicted of Laura Hoteling's murder and sentenced to 30 years to life in prison. It was in prison that he confessed to the murder of Michelle Dorr. Those are the 2 that he is convicted of. But while serving time for those murders, he began to confess to additional crimes. He claimed responsibility for several other murders, children and adults, across multiple states, in a series of chilling jailhouse interviews. And he detailed these killings of more than a dozen people, though not all of these have been substantiated. That's where the grain of salt comes into play. But it's also, authorities believe that Hadden Clark's nomadic lifestyle and his careful disposal of evidence allowed him to evade detection for years, so it's not out of the realm of possibility that he is responsible for up to 10 more murders or more. A big reason why you can't count out Hadden Clark's wild stories and claims is that in 2000, he was actually let out of prison and brought to Cape Cod to Wellfleet to go onto his grandparents' property and find his buried treasures. While on this wild goose chase in Wellfleet, he demanded to be taken to Kmart to get women's clothing to wear, including a wig and a dress. He would sing these hymns while being driven out there and even attempted to murder one of the police officers. While on the property in Wellfleet, no additional bodies were found, but the fact that they did find evidence linked to his known victims, that's where you can't discount what he has said. One of the most infamous aspects of Hadden Clark's life is his claim that he engaged in cannibalism. During his confessions, he told investigators that he had eaten parts of his victims, describing it as a way to, quote, keep them with him forever, end quote. A lot of times when talking about Hadden Clark, things come back to his mental health and the diagnosis with paranoid schizophrenia, and he frequently exhibited delusional thinking and unpredictable behavior in court. This led his defense team to argue that his mental illness should mitigate his culpability, but prosecutors contended that the meticulous efforts to cover up his crimes demonstrated his understanding of right and wrong. Blame for what happened to Hadden Clark naturally shifts to his terrible upbringing and his less than stellar parents. And if you say, well, he's just one bad apple, Hadden Clark's older brother Bradfield was also convicted of murder. In 1984, he killed his girlfriend, Patricia Mack, and dismembered her body. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison for the crime. And this is where the fact that both brothers were convicted murderers led to speculation about the influence of their upbringing on their violent behavior. As I said at the top of this segment, I'm in possession of 8 letters that Hadden Clark wrote. I transcribed them out in full in the Searching for the Lady of the Dunes book. What's crazy about these letters is he covers a lot of the same ground in most of these letters. The story of the Lady of the Dunes, it changes with each letter, but there's so much about the guards at the correctional facility in Maryland treating him poorly, him complaining about his cellmate that he says looks like Jesus, his demands of gifts from Frank in exchange for information, and him describing horrific events so carelessly, but then ending his letters with God bless you or wishing you all the best in your life. It's a scary and creepy thing. I wanted to end this segment off by literally reading some of Hadden Clark's own words. This is the end of the last letter that he wrote to Frank. At this point, he was trying to get Frank to help him get released from prison to come up to Wellfleet to show Frank and me and the rest of the crew where he had a secret diary buried on his grandparents' property. These are his own words.
You're not going to find anything I buried unless I go show you where it is. And I'm tired of people playing me for a fool or trying to play me for a fool. Soon I'm going to talk about everything. My constitutional and Miranda rights being violated and also double jeopardy. And I've kept all your letters. I'm definitely not going to go into any more woods where a sniper can shoot me. I even have stuff hidden in cemeteries in Wellfleet and Hyde Park, New York. Back in 1973, I was working at Camp Wellmet part-time in New York, where I met Bonnie Bickwit when she and her boyfriend Mitch Weiser went to a concert and never returned. I probably was one of the last people to see Bonnie before she disappeared. Her girlfriends used to write me at one time.
He ended off his last letter with,
God bless you. Sincerely yours, Hadden Clark.
This week in history, we are going back 105 years ago to October 9th, 1919, and the infamous Black Sox World Series scandal. The 1919 Chicago White Sox baseball team will forever be associated with one of the darkest moments in sports history. The Black Sox scandal is an incident where several members of the White Sox team conspired to intentionally lose the World Series in exchange for money. This shocked the world, shocked the sports world, and left a stain on baseball's integrity. The White Sox were one of the best teams in Major League Baseball, having won the 1917 World Series. But by 1919, internal discord plagued the team. Owner Charles Comiskey, though he was respected for his baseball acumen, was notoriously cheap, and his players felt undervalued and underpaid. The tension within the team wasn't just about money, it was about respect, with players like Shoeless Joe Jackson and Buck Weaver among the best in the league, but they and others felt that they deserved higher pay for their talent and contributions. For instance, when pitcher Eddie Chicote was nearing a bonus in 1917 for winning 30 games, Comiskey allegedly benched him to avoid paying the incentive. In a time with emerging stars like Babe Ruth and a more modern style of play, the White Sox players had these grievances about compensation. In the 1919 World Series, the Chicago White Sox were heavily favored to win against the Cincinnati Reds, making them an ideal team to bet against, especially with players who were dissatisfied with their treatment. The plot began to take shape when first baseman Arnold Chick Gandil, who was one of the ringleaders of the scandal, approached Joseph Sport Sullivan, a professional gambler, about the possibility of fixing the World Series. Gandil then gathered other conspirators, Eddie Chicote, Claude Lefty Williams, and Swede Risberg. The promise of large sums of money drew them in, as it would be more than the players would ever see from their salaries. For example, Eddie Chicote made $6,000 for the year in 1919, or about $109,000 when adjusted for inflation to 2024, which is crazy to think about. One of the top pitchers in baseball making $109,000 now. They'd make like $30 million. Anyway, he was offered $10,000 up front, or about $182,000 when adjusted for inflation. The 1919 World Series was played under a best-of-9 format instead of the more traditional best-of-7. Eddie Chicote and Lefty Williams, two of the best pitchers in the league, delivered uncharacteristically poor performances. Joe Jackson, one of the greatest hitters in baseball history, played well statistically, but was nonetheless involved in the plot. Though the fix was in and well underway, the payout to the players was inconsistent, with some of the promised money either never materializing or coming late, which led to confusion and anger among the players involved. The gamblers exploited the situation, and the players' greed and dissatisfaction ultimately contributed to the plot's unraveling. The Reds won the World Series 5-3, which raised eyebrows as a huge upset. In 1920, a grand jury convened to investigate the allegations of corruption. Key players Eddie Chicote, Shoeless Joe Jackson, they eventually confessed to their involvement in the fix. The following 8 players were banned for life from baseball: Eddie Chicote, Shoeless Joe Jackson, Claude Lefty Williams, Chick Gandil, Swede Risberg, Buck Weaver, Fred McMullen, and Happy Felsch. They were all banned for life by Commissioner Kennesaw Mountain Landis, who was the first commissioner that was a response to this scandal, baseball actually introducing a commissioner. The 1919 Black Sox scandal remains one of the most infamous moments in sports history, and it took place 105 years ago this week in history. We'll get a little happy music in there after a very depressing This Week in History. This time capsule, we're going to go back 50 years ago this week to October 10th, 1974. Let's see what was going on in the world of pop culture back then. The number one song was I Honestly Love You by Olivia Newton-John. This was off of her album Long Live Love. This was Olivia Newton-John's first number one hit, and the song was nominated for 3 Grammys, winning 2 of them. The number one movie was The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and you could get into the theater with a ticket costing $1.87. Oh, so fitting for spooky season, one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. It's about a rural, backwoods Texas cannibal family and the group of teens that stumble upon them. It is way more psychological than you think and less gory than you think, with some of the elements being based in reality and based around serial killer Ed Gein. The crazy thing is, where I heard that parts of Texas Chainsaw were based in reality was in after-school religious education that I did up through freshman year of high school. And it wasn't from another student, it was from a teacher. The original Texas Chainsaw is 89% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, and made nearly $31 million on a budget of only $140,000. The number one TV show was All in the Family, because basically every 70s time capsule I do, it's all in the family. The story of Archie Bunker, the racist bigot, and his exploits with his family in Queens, New York. It's routinely considered one of the most important and one of the best TV shows ever made. The show was on the air in its initial incarnation as All in the Family for 9 seasons from 1971 to 1979, before being transitioned to Archie Bunker's Place for another few seasons. And if you were around back then, October 10th, 1974, maybe it's time for you to go grocery shopping for the week for the family. Well, you're in luck. This week's Purity Supreme flyer has got special bosses coupons, which they ask you to go talk to the boss at whatever Purity Supreme you're at to get special deals. But if you don't want to talk to the boss, there's plenty of awesome deals at Purity Supreme, including deals on fine china dishes that you could get for 33 cents each, bread and butter dishes, if you spent $5. And it's Italian Festival Week for some reason at Purity Supreme. So get your copy of their Informed Shoppers Bulletin for more about Italian Festival. That'll wrap up a brand new time capsule, brand new This Week in History, with Texas Chainsaw Massacre being number 1 in the time capsule. It's only fitting now for the top 5 that we look at top 5 1990s horror movies coming up right now. When the 1990s began, horror movies were in kind of a rut. An overwhelming glut of slasher movies had clogged up the horror genre, with the majority of the slasher movies being terrible. Although some terribly good horror movies came out too, meaning they were terrible, but I enjoyed them. By the end of the 90s, the slasher film and horror movies in general had made a bit of a comeback. But what were the top 5 1990s horror movies? Well, that's the point of this segment right here. This was a pretty easy list to begin, but then a hard one to narrow down and kind of hone in. Because as a teenager of the 1990s, I'm familiar with so many of these horror movies, and it actually makes me glad that most of these top 5 lists are in no particular order, because it was hard enough to get it down to the 5 and some honorable mentions. So let's dive right into this list with the honorable mentions, because this list really doesn't need much of a setup. It's pretty self-explanatory. So honorable mentions for best 1990s horror movies include Halloween H2O from 1998. This movie reinvigorated the Halloween franchise until Halloween Resurrection came out a few years later and killed it worse than ever. There is Audition, which is a Japanese horror movie from 1999 that has some of the most disturbing scenes I've ever seen in a horror movie. There was Candyman from 1992 about the knife-wielding urban legend Candyman played by Tony Todd. There was It, Stephen King's novel, the original television movie that came out in 1990 and starred Tim Curry as Pennywise the Clown. And the last honorable mention is Night of the Living Dead, the remake from 1990. This also starred Tony Todd and was a pretty good, faithful adaptation. Better in a few ways, like special effects, but you can't really top the original. So those are the honorable mentions. How many of those have you seen? I'm thinking probably at best 4 out of the 5, with Audition being one you probably haven't seen. It's very disturbing if you're going to watch it, just as a heads up. But let's get into the actual top 5 1990s horror movies, starting with number 1, Scream. This came out in 1996, right after I graduated high school. Wes Craven from A Nightmare on Elm Street directed this, and it basically revitalized the slasher genre. It was way more meta than any other horror movie before it. Very self-aware of the tropes of horror movies. It starred a lot of new or up-and-coming stars like Neve Campbell, Courtney Cox, David Arquette. It centers around Ghostface's killing people in the town of Woodsboro, California, tormenting Neve Campbell's Sydney, whose mother was murdered a year before. The original Scream was a surprise hit. They didn't think it would do very well with the decline of slasher movies, but it made $173 million at the box office. And so far, there are 6 movies in the Scream franchise, with a 7th in development. And speaking of director Wes Craven, that leads to number 2, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Much like he revitalized the slasher genre with Scream, Wes Craven revitalized Freddy Krueger with this movie. It's from 1994, and again, it's a very meta movie. It's about Freddy Krueger, the character, as kind of an entity trying to cross over into reality. So you've got Freddy Krueger, but then you've got all of the actors and actresses from the original Nightmare on Elm Street also playing themselves. So Heather Langenkamp, Robert Englund, John Saxon, and Wes Craven himself, they're all in it. It's 79% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, making it only the 3rd of 7 Nightmare on Elm Street movies have a positive review, and the first since Nightmare on Elm Street Part 3. In the theater, it wasn't that big of a hit. It made less than $20 million on a budget of $8 million. But if you enjoy the Nightmare on Elm Street series, you'll love this movie. Number 3 is Silence of the Lambs. This movie is from 1991. It stars Jodie Foster as FBI agent in training, Clarice Starling, trying to solve the Buffalo Bill murder case with the help of incarcerated murderer Dr. Hannibal Lecter, played by Anthony Hopkins. This movie is an anomaly in the world of horror because not only is it 95% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, but it was nominated for 7 Academy Awards and won 5, including the Academy Award for Best Picture. You imagine any horror movie winning Best Picture? It's a rare combination of a movie that's really good, that you enjoy as a horror movie, that actually is critically acclaimed. Because I've seen plenty of horror movies in my life that are not critically acclaimed. Most of the Friday the 13th I like, they're horribly critically panned. Now, Silence of the Lambs has also led to several sequels of varying success and varying critical response, but the original can't be denied as one of the best horror movies maybe of all time. Number 4 is Misery. This 1990 film is another adaptation of a Stephen King work starring Kathy Bates and James Caan. Those of you that have seen it can picture the most famous scene in your head right now, the sledgehammer and ankles scene. Nothing prepares you for that scene as a 13, 14-year-old kid because the movie is grounded in reality. An author crashes his car in a snowstorm. He's rescued by someone who ends up being a huge super fan, but is more of a crazy stalker fan. But it's all grounded in reality. So when Kathy Bates puts that chunk of railroad tie between James Caan's legs and swings the sledgehammer at his feet, you can't prepare yourself for it. Kathy Bates won a Best Actress Oscar at the Academy Awards, and it's the only Stephen King work to ever be Academy Award winning. And finally, number 5 on the list of top 5 1990s horror movies is The Blair Witch Project. In episode 152, I did a deeper dive into The Blair Witch Project on its 25th anniversary. This is the OG, really, of the found footage genre. Sure, they did movies before that were considered found footage, but none of them on the scope of Blair Witch. It made so much money on such a shoestring budget that it's one of the biggest independent film success stories ever. The sequel right after was crap, and the movie itself was parodied a bit in later years with those foolish, scary movie films. But when it came out, The Blair Witch Project, about 3 missing filmmakers in the woods at Burkittsville, Maryland, It was a cultural phenomenon. This movie made just under $250 million on a budget of roughly $60,000. Quick math, that means that Blair Witch made back more than 4,000 times its budget. It's insane. So those are my picks for the top 5 1990s horror movies. How many of those do you agree with? How many have you yet to see that you're going to go see today after you shut the podcast off? In episode 116, I did a top 5 1970s horror movies countdown. And in episode 88, I did top 5 1980s horror movies. I'm sure I'll do either a 2000s or a 1960s one at some point, but we go from best horror movies of the decade to an unreal, a little bit spooky, and 100% true story from my own life, having a pet bat. So this segment here is going to be kind of a mishmash of a few different stories, with all kind of leading the same narrative. I have said ad nauseum on here that I am so grateful for the time period that I grew up. Child of the 80s, teen of the 90s, living in kind of a rural-ish area, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. A simpler time period before internet and smartphones, when kids would be outside until the streetlights came on, riding their bikes over God knows where, walking to the corner store, hiding dirty magazines in tree stumps. Don't listen to that part. Living in this rural-ish neighborhood on Cape Cod, my friends and I that lived there, we would play baseball in the street. Now, not wanting to damage people's homes, it was typically a tennis ball, and we had a wiffle ball that was sufficiently wrapped in electrical tape to give it some weight. Typically, when we would play, there'd be a batter, a pitcher, and then probably an outfielder, because what we would normally do is home run derby. The two stalwarts of our baseball games, it was typically me and my friend Matt, who, if you need to know more about, I did a full bonus episode about him back in episode 30. These baseball games would be summertime. We would have home plate drawn in chalk kind of on the edge of my yard, because we also had a basketball hoop and spray painted lines for the 3-point line and free throw line. So home plate had to be away from that. And one of us would pitch to the other with a tennis ball. How we judged home runs, it's kind of a funny story. It wouldn't be so much where the ball landed. It had to clear the top of the power lines, which I probably should go back and measure how far it was. It wasn't that far. The reason I say this was kind of funny, ironic, is later on when the Tampa Bay Rays became a baseball team, their field, Tropicana Field, has these rules with if home runs clear certain catwalks up in the ceiling, they're considered home runs. And I remember saying when that rule came out, I said, God, it's like when I used to play baseball in the street on Cherry Lane. It's like, that's the kind of team they are. I don't know when the first incident happened, but we'd be playing baseball usually after dinner. So in summer until dark. So we'd be out in front of the house until almost 9 o'clock. At some point, one of us hit a ball, a pop-up. I don't know if it was a home run, but something came after the ball when it was in the air. So I'm back there with my glove, or Matt was with his glove, looking up, and the ball's there, and all of a sudden there's a second ball. Something swooped by. And the game stopped, and we were trying to figure out what in the world it was. We thought maybe it was a bird. These memories are a good 35 years ago, so they're a bit fuzzy, but the main points I remember. At some point, we noticed something went after the tennis ball when we had hit it in the air, so we decided to see if it would come back again. We began just playing catch, throwing the ball as high as we could in the air, and sure enough, a couple different times, this thing came swooping at the ball. I'm pretty sure one of our parents confirmed for us that it was a bat. I don't know if it was out for a hunt. I don't know why it chose to come after the tennis ball. This became an added attraction, an added bonus of not just playing baseball, but being outside. It happened so many times, dusk in the summer. I'd be out in front of my house or Matt's house. We were, 2 houses down from each other, playing catch, and bats would come and swoop at the ball. It gets even more interesting, and this is 100% true. I swear to you, more than once, enough that it's been burned in my memory, we would throw the ball in the air, and the bat, whichever one was out there, would catch the ball and take off with it. But the ball was a little bit too big, I think, because it would end up dropping it down the street. We would see it. The bat would catch the tennis ball, fly away with it, but then not be able to hold on to it or realize it wasn't food. It was a fuzzy green tennis ball, and it would drop it. That became another game, seeing how many times the bats would swoop down to grab the tennis balls, seeing how many times they could actually catch it and throw it down the street and make us go catch it. As kids, we were 11, 12, 13 years old. We liked to think that the bat was playing catch with us, making us go run after it. The bat that became our friend here on Cape Cod, it's just called the big brown bat. They've got a wingspan of anywhere from about 12 to 14 inches. I had to look it up to see which kind of bats are common on Cape Cod because it was dusk. We never saw the bat besides the fact that we would see it swoop and grab the ball. And you know the difference between bat wings and bird wings. This went on for several years. I'm not saying it was the same bat waiting for us, but it was at least 3 summers that Matt and I would play baseball and the bats would be there to grab the ball and take off, or at least attempt to. Only a few weeks ago from when I'm recording this podcast, I did the final sunset run of the season because sunset's getting too early. And I was running this local middle school track, and it was so dark, it was dusk, and bats started flying around the track. Not swooping on me, but they were just there. And this memory, this story is so ingrained in me that I had wished I had a tennis ball with me. And I'm tempted to go and try this again to see if bats really do that. I already had experience with bats as being friendly creatures when we got our own pet bat. Again, this story is 100% true. The memories might be a bit fuzzy as we're going back 35 years, but the gist of it is all there. Based on my research, I'm assuming that this was another big brown bat. A baby or a wounded baby brown bat was on the ground in the front yard of my mother's friend's house, way at the other end of the street. My mother's friend, her kids, we were all like one big family back then. And I don't know if it was all of my siblings and I don't know if all 5 of us went down to their house, but we were called down to see this baby bat in their yard. I don't know which one of us decided this. I don't know how it happened, but for some reason, this baby brown bat was brought into our family, brought up the street, at least several hundred yards, walking with this baby bat, and brought into the house to have it as a pet, to nurse it to health. To my best memories, and my family will be able to correct this maybe, I thought this was either 1989 or 1990, so I was 12 or 13. My baby sisters, who are now 40 each, they would have been 5 or 6. And having the experience with the bats grabbing the tennis balls, they were seen as just another pet. We had a dog, we had 2 cats at the time, and now we had a bat. I believe we ended up putting this bat in a hermit crab cage, which I could swear it was sort of like a bird cage. Maybe it was a bird cage, but my sisters just put hermit crabs in it. But it was sort of like a zoo or animal reserve where they get injured animals and nurse them back to life. My mother, my stepfather, my siblings, and I would feed this baby bat that was, no bigger than your thumb. I think my sister Kate used to feed it bits of ham. I don't know if bats eat things like that, but I'm sure as a baby, it's like whatever is there and available. It was the talk of the neighborhood. We would tell all of our friends we had a pet bat, and it was named Brownie. There you go. Big brown bat named Brownie. You can tell that it was named by a child. And Brownie the bat would be a typical bat. It would hang upside down in the cage, sleeping like you would think a bat would do. It actually did. I don't remember exactly what the time period is, how long we had Brownie the bat as a pet. It's probably shorter of a time than I think, but in my mind, I thought it was something like a couple of weeks. Now, what happened to Brownie? Well, my mother and stepfather definitely were into keeping this bat as a pet. One thing they had to know was whether Brownie was born rabid. So did Brownie have rabies? You know how you test for rabies, at least in the late 80s, early 90s, especially when it came to bats? I don't know if it's true for all cases, but when we got in touch with the animal people, they came over and tested Brownie for rabies by ripping his head off. I don't know if it was quite that cut and dry. I just know that they killed Brownie in order to test him for rabies and then said, no, I didn't have him. This is how our time with a pet bat ended. Calling the animal control, asking about rabies, and them coming over and killing our pet bat and then saying it didn't have rabies. Maybe that's a reason why I wanted to keep playing baseball at dusk out in front of the house, was to maybe nail another bat with a tennis ball and then take it in and have a new pet. The story of Brownie the bat, it definitely doesn't scar me. Not like having cats get hit by cars or dogs have to get put down. Brownie the bat, it was such a small part of my childhood, but it was so impactful because it's a weird story. You imagine that, having a pet bat when you were a kid, even for a little while. That's one of those only in the 80s or early 90s, only on Cape Cod type stories that's too crazy to not be true. But until next time, that's going to wrap up episode 165 of the In My Footsteps podcast. Thank you to everyone who tunes in. Thank you to those of you especially who share the podcast with others. I finally reached the threshold for downloads that I can have ads on my show and make a little bit of money on the side here with the podcast. I have to choose ads that are appropriate for the show. So I've had a few get sent to me, like, here, do you want to approve this ad for your show? And I'm like, that doesn't really fit what I'm doing here. I'm not just going to choose ads for the sake of it. It's got to actually be something that fits into my narrative of my podcast. But I couldn't get to this point without you who listen and who tell others to listen. And I've got so much content that I hope that people find me somehow, and the whole spider web is so big that it draws them in. I've got 165 episodes of this podcast. I've got hundreds of videos on YouTube, so go subscribe over there. I've got hundreds of blogs, the In My Footsteps podcast blog, Initial Impressions 2.0. Now I've got video podcasts. My routine is now record this audio podcast. When I'm done, I'm going to flip on my ring light. I'm looking at it right now. Plug this microphone in again and record the video podcast, weekly webcam wrap-up. If you're interested in any of my 9 books, visit ChristopherSutherland.com, my homepage. It's got links to all of those books. 2 weeks from today, when the podcast goes live, October 23rd, catch me at 2 p.m. at the Eldridge Library in Chatham. I'll be talking about my Searching for the Lady of the Dunes book. I'll have copies of that book, copies of several other books, because holiday season will be here soon. Why not get some signed copies of these books? Next week will be episode 166 of the podcast. Still knee-deep in spooky season. We're going to look at some of the most notorious New England mental hospitals. We're going to look back at a Halloween safety film from 1977 that hit me in all the right feels. There will be some unique horror movies that were made into video games, and so much more next week on episode 166. It's a lot of work doing all of this content. I've been chasing this dream of doing something that I can make money on with my mind, creative. It's the old, if you love what you do for work, you don't work a day in your life. I like my day job, but this is my biggest drive, my obsession. And when I see my downloads for the show continually increasing over this year, when I get positive feedback on my YouTube videos, when I see the views for some of those go flying up beyond what I thought, it keeps me going because I can see it's kind of the snowball rolling down the hill. Just keep putting out content and keep bringing in more and more viewers or listeners. You don't have to be a content creator, a writer, podcaster, whatever you want to call what I do, to learn from my story, my journey. It's just determination and putting in the time, making the time if you believe in what you're doing. And that goes for whatever it is that you're doing, you listening, or whatever you want to do. Just keep moving forward. I have several people I know in my life that I have told them that they have knowledge that would be great for a podcast. But a lot of it comes down to time. I think I'm lucky that I have the time to do this. Even if it is sometimes 15, 20 hours a week on top of my full-time job. So thank you all again for listening, because it makes all of those hours, all of the editing and research and marketing of all my content worthwhile. And remember, as I always say, in this life, don't walk in anyone else's footsteps. Create your own path and enjoy every moment you can on this journey we call life, because you never know what tomorrow brings. This has been the In My Footsteps podcast. I am Christopher Setterland. You already knew that. And I'll talk to you all again soon.